Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Braumoeller. He's a professor in the Department of Political Science at Ohio State University. His research is in the areas of international security and computational social science. His current research focuses on the relationship between international order and international conflict. He is the author of The Great Powers and the International System, and the book we're going to focus on today, Only the Dead, the Persistence of War in the Modern Age. So, Dr. Braumoeller, thank you for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, so perhaps let's start with some basic questions. Since we're talking about war, I guess that, and this will be important for later points in our conversation when we discuss for example, the decline of war thesis. What is war? I mean, how do you define war?
War generally is, in the broadest sense, it's armed conflict among human aggregates above a certain size. Now, how exactly to operationalize that and code it really depends on, it's very era specific, since the size of human aggregates has changed quite a bit. During the period that I examine in the book, which is after the Napoleonic Wars, use the correlates of war definition of a war, excuse me, which is armed conflict between two or more states, recognized states in the interstate system, that results in more than 1,000 battle deaths. So that's the general definition of war that I take a look at. But also in the book, because the hypothesis about the decline of war is really about the decline of the use of force, I also take a look at uses of force directed by one state against another. And there the criterion is there has to be some use of force, and it has to be authorized by the state in question. It can't just be somebody like taking a pot shot across a border at somebody else. There has to be evidence that it was authorized by somewhere in the state bureaucracy. So those are the two different ways of thinking about war and conflict that I think are relevant to the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and when do you think wars started in the history of humanity? Because there are different perspectives. Some people say that it started only with agricultural societies because people were political leaders were able to mobilize men for armies and war. But some people say that it comes before that, and we find it occurring between different hunter-gatherer tribes, for example?
I tend to fall in the latter school. I mean, in fact, I think, what we observe, we sometimes observe war among bands of chimpanzees. That same impetus is there even in non-human primates. So, I think war has been around as long as people have been around. As a matter of fact, one of the nice, there's a very nice book called Sapiens. Yuval Noah Harari wrote it, and he argues that essentially, from the very beginning of the species, war was sort of our thing. We were very good at fighting, mostly targeting our aggression at things that were good to eat in the early years, but that we've always been a very fundamentally aggressive species.
Mm-hmm. And do we know what are the causes of war? What are the things that cause war?
Well, there's a whole cottage industry in that question.
Okay.
There are a bunch of there are a handful of signposts that I can point to in this literature, but there's a very large literature mostly within the political science, international relations area, but also some sociologists contribute as well, and others that examine the sources of human aggression and conflict. And a few substantial patterns have jumped out. For one thing, we tend not to see democracies fight one another. So there's something about democracies that tends to dampen the impulse toward war. And there've been you can make a whole long list of things from mistrust to innate aggressiveness to so on and so forth that have been posited as theories of war. A lot of these are, I think, what a scholar like Kenneth Waltz would call first image theories. That is, they project the characteristics of individuals onto the characteristics of states, and they miss one important thing about states. And the process of war, and that is that whenever there's a disagreement that might lead to war, there's a possibility for a negotiated solution that doesn't involve war. And so that's actually, I think, the genius behind a 1995 paper by Jim Fearon that points out that really what we need to explain anytime we're going to explain war, we have to explain why there wasn't a negotiated settlement first. Or instead, rather. And his argument has to do with the fact that uncertainty about other states' war costs can prompt you to gamble quite rationally, without any sort of, without any of the 7 deadly sins playing a role in your, in your calculations. That it can be very rational to run a low risk of war in order to get more of what you want. And that if you do that often enough, once in a while, you get involved in wars. And that, I think, is, probably the dominant understanding at this point in the field of how it is that wars begin. But I wouldn't say there's unanimity by any stretch.
Mm-hmm. But have the causes of war changed over time?
Oh, sure. They change over the course of decades. One of the neat things about this book, I started writing it a while ago, and I had a couple of very concrete ideas in mind about how it is that I would chart, changes in conflict. But then I got into a conversation with a former colleague of mine, a co-teacher, Andy Moravchik, and Andy had a very different interpretation of what the decline of war thesis meant. He thought that it meant that the causes of war had become less potent over time. That the kinds of things that would prompt a war 100 years ago do not, the same circumstances don't provoke the same response. And I thought that was a really interesting interpretation. It wasn't one that anybody else had looked at. So I created a new chapter in the book just to explore it. And what I found was really quite striking. I looked at a decade's worth of studies of uses of force, militarized interstate disputes, the lower level conflicts that I talked about a minute ago. And what I found was that the potency of those causes waxed and waned over time without any really coherent pattern, right? The pattern that emerged is that sometimes, territorial disputes are a big thing for a little while, and sometimes nationalist disputes are a big thing for a little while. And, those eras come and go, but they don't really have there's no coherent upward or downward trend overall. Like, you don't see all of them trending downward, which is the pattern that I've been looking for. But yeah, the causes of war, and frankly, this is a problem for a lot of statistical analysis in political science, because, we look at a data set of wars or conflicts that covers 200 years, and we run statistical routines that assume that the impact of a variable on the probability of war is constant over that whole time. And one of the things that jump out from this analysis is that that's really, really not true. That, the causes of war the potency of the causes of war really fluctuate a lot over time.
Yeah. With the knowledge and the data we have access to nowadays, is it possible to predict wars?
Not really, and it may actually be inherently impossible. You can let me put it this way. I'm sorry, my cat will be joining us for the interview. Otherwise, she'll be interjecting her own opinion the entire time.
Sure.
No, what we can do is, I think we're a lot like seismologists, in that seismologists can tell you that Japan or California has a lot of earthquakes, and Ohio doesn't have very many at all. By the same token, we can point to, the Middle East as a place that has had a lot of conflicts in recent years, and North America as a place that hasn't. So we can tell you at that level, where you're more likely to see a war, more or less likely to see a war break out in a given year. What we can't do, and what seismologists can't do, is tell you that, it's going to happen next Tuesday. We don't know exactly when those tensions are going to break out. There, the potential exists, at varying degrees at varying times. It's extremely it's very straightforward to tell you where the war-prone regions are, and extremely difficult to say anything specific about when wars are likely to break out. So can we predict wars? At some level, yes, but not the specific timing of the breakout of a conflict.
Mm-hmm. Can we say that individuals start wars? Because, for example, when we think about the Napoleonic Wars, we think about Napoleon, World
Right.
War II, about Hitler, and so on and so forth. So is it really individuals that start wars?
Yeah, I mean, and as you point out, there are wars that are named for people. So you sort of, it's not too much of a leap to think that, those people, are primarily responsible for the onset of conflict. And I think the answer depends on whether you think about, war in a counterfactual sense or in a holistic sense. In a counterfactual sense, had Hitler been killed when he was a corporal in World War I, would we have seen World War II? Probably not. You never know. There might have been another Hitler waiting in the wings, who might have done the same thing, driven by similar structural pressures. So you can point to a lot of counterfactuals. It's easy to point to counterfactuals like, kill Hitler in World War II probably doesn't happen. It's difficult to know what the full implications of killing Hitler would have been. It may have produced a different war at a different time, started by a different person. But I think if you, so I think thinking counterfactually like that tends to emphasize the dangers we know and underemphasize the dangers that we don't know. So that you tend to get this, in a naive counterfactual sense, I guess I would say, it's not too difficult to imagine wars not happening if one person had not been around. In a more holistic sense, though, I mean, where did these people come from? They're not just kind of, put down on earth, out of the blue with all of these ideas and all of these abilities, and the people, they are very much a product of their times. And the times themselves, I think, have a certain impetus. And it's sort of like water flowing downhill. If I block off this particular stream, is the water going to follow that stream? No, it's not. But if there's enough sort of pressure going in that direction, it'll find a different path to go in the same way. So, I tend to be a little wary of, of the straight up argument that that single people are really essential to the onset of a war. They might be essential for the onset of that war as it happened at that time, but they might not, they might not be essential to the existence of conflict itself in some form.
Mm-hmm. So in the book, you point to several things we have to take into account when studying if war is in decline or not. And you mentioned the rates of conflict initiation. So what is the best way of measuring those rates?
That's it's a tricky question and somewhat technical. So a rate is just the frequency of something divided by the number of opportunities for that thing to happen. Mm-hmm. Okay. So in the context of conflict, which I mentioned earlier, is simply the use of force, right? One state against another. we've got a pretty good data set, the militarized interstate dispute data set, that measures uses of force going back to the Napoleonic era. It's not unreasonable to think that some of the lower level, it also measures threats and displays of force, and probably a lot of those get missed historically. I think it does a pretty good job with uses of force. So we have the numerator, right? We have with the frequency with which conflicts are initiated, but we still need to normalize that by the number of opportunities for conflict, because the size of the international system grows dramatically over the course of 200 years. So of course you're going to expect to see more militarized interstate disputes in the 20th century than the 19th, because there are more countries to fight. At the same time, as the international system grows, more and more of those states get smaller, weaker, and farther away from each other, right? So at the beginning of the 19th century, you saw a lot of countries that could very easily, or a small number of countries that could very easily reach each other, mostly in Europe. And by the end of the 20th century, you've got countries over the entire world, most of which can't actually reach each other. So you need to normalize by the ability of one country to reach another. And there are a handful of ways of doing this. I use a measure that a co-author of mine, Austin Carson, and I came up with in a paper that we wrote, that basically takes into account whether a country is a major power, that is, can it project force well beyond its own borders, whether states are contiguous, and what the distance is between them. And when you take those three things into account, you get a measure of what's called political relevance that does a very good job of sorting wars and non-wars into sorting countries into those that can fight and those that can't. I think you get about 90% accuracy in the metric, and as we ended up using it. So that's the quantity that I divide by, is the political relevance of that's our proxy measure for the number of opportunities that states have to fight each other. Now, I'll be the first to admit that it's not perfect, right? I mean, if you look at the Korean War, you see a number of states, Turkey and North Korea would not show up as being politically relevant in our data set, but in fact, they fight each other during the Korean War. So there are some, it's very, very difficult to get a perfect measure, but this is, as a measure that does a really good job most of the time, this one works pretty well.
Mm-hmm. In the book, you also distinguish between the magnitude, severity, and intensity of war. Could you explain that?
Sure. So in Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, he makes, to which this book is an extended response. He makes one good point about measuring war, and that is that there isn't any one simple measure of it. And he uses an analogy to arson. He says, let's say you've got two villages, neighboring villages, not even neighboring necessarily. One of them has a lot of arsonists, but very few trees. And another one has very few arsonists, but it's got a lot of very densely interconnected forests. Which village has the biggest arson problem? And he says, you could argue it either way. And I think that's a really good analogy, because, there's no common currency between the onset and lethality of war. They're two different dimensions of war. So I treated them as two different dimensions, and I measured them as such. So what we've been talking about is the onset of war. And what you just asked about is the second dimension, the lethality of war. So then the question arises, all right, so we have a measure of battle deaths, fine. It actually doesn't include civilian deaths, which is problematic from my point of view, but it's not anything you can, even recent wars, you have huge disagreement over how many civilian casualties there actually were. So this is a major problem in literature, but we have reliable estimates of the number of people who were killed in battle, and we can use that as a proxy. And so then the question becomes, do we just use raw battle deaths as a measure of the lethality of war? Well, the world population and state populations have grown a lot since 1815. Is a war that kills 1,000 people still, the same thing in 2020, 2021? I don't know. It's an interesting question. But there have been a couple of, a related question is, if you've got Russia and China fighting a war, does 1,000 people killed in battle mean the same thing as it does if you've got two very small island nations fighting each other? Mm-hmm. Probably not. So there are two different measures of the lethality of war that are commonly used in the literature, and a third one that Professor Pinker introduced. The ones that are commonly used in the literature are severity, which is just raw battle deaths, and intensity, which is raw battle deaths divided by the pooled population of all the countries that are fighting. So it's normalized by the sizes of the countries involved. And Professor Pinker comes up with a third measure, introduces a third measure, which I've never seen before, battle deaths normalized by world population. And that's what I end up calling prevalence, because there isn't really an established name for it. And that measure I don't love, because it means that if you fight a war in the center of Africa, that the populations of China and India are relevant to how deadly it is, which just seems weird. I'm more comfortable with normalizing by the size of the countries involved, because I tend to think that 1,000 battle deaths is going to be a tragedy, no matter where it happens. I don't mean to imply that it won't, but for some countries it would wipe out their military entirely, whereas others it would barely make a dent. So that's the logic behind my preference for intensity as a measure. But I should emphasize that it's important to look at all of them, because I can't definitively say there's no way to say one of them is right and the other's wrong. I can see problems in each one, but I think I do end up looking at all of them, and I find no trends in any of them over time.
Mm-hmm. Do you also consider deaths that occur after the war and that are the consequence of it? And perhaps the social, economic, political impact that wars have on societies?
No, I don't. And this falls into the category of, the broader category of civilian deaths. And I've seen there are a couple of, there's no data set available that would allow me to do that, and I don't have the resources to create one. I know Gary King at Harvard and Paul Huth at Maryland and a few other people were involved in an initiative, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago to measure exactly that. They were funded by the National Institutes of Health, excuse me, and they ended up publishing, I think, a single paper on it. The deaths continue long after the wars have stopped, or something along those lines. But what they weren't able to do was kind of crack the nut of, finding a really good way to measure that more generally. The way that has been, the way that I've seen people do it or try to do it, approximate it, is essentially to take a look at, extrapolate pre-war population growth, mm-hmm. and then compare the population, 5 or 10 years down the line, or whenever the war ends, plus 2 or 3 years or something along those lines, to get an estimate of how many people the war killed. But those estimates tend to be kind of controversial, in that lots of things happen during wartime, and some of them may be attributable to, some deaths may be attributable to war and some might not. There's a really good section in Josh Goldstein's book, Winning the War on War, with which I somewhat disagree. I disagree much more with Pinker's book, but I think Goldstein's has some very good points in it. And one of them is he goes into depth about a case exactly like this, in the 1990s, where the estimates are based on that methodology and are pretty unreliable. So there isn't a great way to incorporate that. Moreover, I think the tricky part of the question of, which war deaths to include is that the Pinker thesis about the decline of war is a broader thesis about the decline of violence. And if your side intentionally kills the mayor of a town on the other side, and as a result the entire town starves or something like that, and that wasn't really your intent, it still gets counted as, so that's one of the reasons that battle deaths, I think, is as a measure, is on better footing in examining Pinker's thesis than it often is in other studies of war, is that it really is an argument about intentionality.
So what would you say are the most important points of the decline of war thesis put forth by Steven Pinker and others?
Well, they vary in terms of ambition. I know Josh Goldstein's book argues that there's been a decline in deaths mainly in interstate wars, and he attributes a lot of it to peacekeeping after the end of the Cold War. John Mueller argues that really the beginning of the decline in war dates back to World War I, and I think he's got it's kind of funny. He obviously has to deal with the fact that it was World War I and that we had a World War II. But he takes sort of the extreme view of Hitler as the one man cause of World War II, and the rest of humanity was on board with with war being in decline. And there was a huge peace movement in the interwar period, and a lot of discussion of outlawing war and so on and so forth. So I think on the historical merits, I think he's got a point that was a very different time from the period that preceded it. I just unfortunately don't think it ended up producing less conflict. But Steven Pinker's argument is that you can see a downward trend in almost all dimensions of warfare for centuries, and that you can see a decline in the lethality of warfare after World War II. I mean, World War II is by most measures, certainly in absolute terms, the largest conflict in human history. And
isn't that what people call the long peace after World War II?
Yeah, they originally used that phrase for the 19th century, but John Gaddis, wrote an article which really was about stability among the major powers. But when Pinker picked it up and started writing about it, he interpreted it as being much more about developed countries at the core, but also humanity in general, experiencing a long peace during the Cold War period. And that also doesn't match up with evidence, but anyway, so it really depends on which author you read. If you're listening to Goldstein, really this is a post-Cold War phenomenon, but if you're listening to Pinker, it's been going on for centuries.
So there are several different arguments that Pinker and others put on the table to say that war is in fact in decline. Let's go through some of them. So one of them, and you talk about it in the book, has to do with attitudes about war. So
right.
Have people's attitudes changed over time, and do they have any effect on, for example, rates of conflict initiation?
I think popular attitudes about conflict have changed, and I think the biggest change you can point to is, as I said, post World War I, where there really was a huge peace movement. But I think I don't think it ended up making it. Well, I know it didn't make a difference in terms of rates of conflict initiation or in terms of the lethality of war. And I think part of the reason is that, it's easy not to like war in the abstract, right? But there are outcomes that you really care about in the international system. And, if you care about them enough, you'll fight for them. And that's always been the case. I mean, I think the people who, who speak out against war in the interwar period tend to see it as being, I don't know, something that is entered into lightly by major powers, without much, without a compelling motivation. And looking at World War I, you can kind of make you can kind of understand why they, came to that conclusion, because certainly there was a sense that the entire continent had just slid into a war that ended up being much bigger than they anticipated it would be. But but for the most part, when countries get engaged in war, it's with a significant regret. They really wish there could have been some other outcome. Mm-hmm. And it's for objectives that they think are worth fighting and dying for. So, we can talk about war being a bad thing all we want, but as long as there continue to be things that we're willing to fight and die for, we're going to keep fighting wars.
Mm-hmm. So Pinker also says or argues that civilization had a pacifying effect on people. Is that right?
Oh, here we're kind of outside my area because we're talking about much longer spans of time. I can say a couple of things though. He does have a couple of charts in his book where he points to, gee, look at these non-state groups and look at the percentage of people who died from war in these non-state groups, and it's actually much bigger than the percentage that died in state groups. Mm-hmm. And what that analysis completely fails to take into account is the fact that those non-state groups are smaller, and just by virtue of the nature of random events, sometimes you're going to see, you generally see more variation in outcomes in small groups than you do in large ones. So that's why, for example, if you take a look at let's say you look at a US map and you look at the prevalence of COVID-19 at any point during the COVID crisis, you can tell where the cities are. And you can generally tell where the cities are because, they're concentrated. There are a lot of people there. They tend to have higher rates. But because there's a large number of people, there's not a lot of variation in COVID rates. When you look at counties, especially smaller counties, you see, a much more diverse patchwork appear. Some counties are totally untouched, and others, seem to have just incredible problems with COVID. And that is in part because they're smaller and there's more of a chance, more of a role for random chance to play in whether or not they get hit with an infection. So the same applies to death rates in small versus large societies. And when you take that into account, this is, I don't know, a little bit snarky, but I thought, an illustration really to bring this home was I took a look at the death rates from poisoning, which includes, drug overdoses in American states versus American counties. Now, obviously, everybody, in the U.S. is a resident of both, and the counties are just sort of smaller aggregations. But the same kind of graph that Pinker produces for non-state societies versus states, you get exactly the same pattern if you look at counties versus states in the U.S., even though you're looking at exactly the same data. So it may seem like an abstract statistical point to say that there's more variation in small samples, but it makes a huge difference in the interpretation of the data that he puts out there. So that was one of the reasons I was very skeptical of that claim. Now, if you talk to archaeologists, they'll have different interpretations. This is still something that's being fought, discussed actively in that literature. And I don't really contribute to it or consume it very much. And I'm probably not worth talking to on the subject. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Is it important to distinguish between different kinds of wars, like interstate wars, extra-state wars, and non-state wars, for example?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because so for example, let's just take the example of lethality, right?
Yeah.
If you it makes sense to separate them because those kinds of wars may very well, and in the case of civil wars and international wars, we know are lethal to different degrees, right? So that's one thing. And if you pool them together and try to look at all of the data, thank you, to to find trends in in lethality of war over time, and you say, oh look, I found that war has become war became less lethal during this particular period. What that might mean is that you're seeing fewer international wars and more civil wars, right? But that the lethality of international wars hasn't changed, and the lethality of civil wars hasn't changed. So you can get you can get what's called an ecological inference problem, where you're aggregating above the level of the units that you should be looking at. Another reason I think to separate them is that there are robust literatures on these different kinds of wars that model them in different ways and argue for very different causes. For example, one of the most common causes of civil war or one of the most common variables that's included in analyses of civil wars is the percentage of mountainous terrain in a given country. Well, it's important in a civil war because if you've got lots of mountains, you have places to hide. And that gives you an opportunity to fall back that you wouldn't have in Poland, for example. And so that's one of the variables in civil war, and it always shows up. My recollection is almost always shows up as being a significant contributor to the onset of civil war. Nobody looks at mountainous terrain when it comes to international wars. That's just not a relevant consideration. So as much as they tend to be aggregated, I think, in popular perception, they're studied as being very different things, and I think it's very fruitful to do so because you can make a good case that they have different causes.
Mm-hmm. So another explanation that Steven Pinker puts forth in his books, Enlightenment Now and the Better Angels of Our Nature, has to do with the spread of Enlightenment values. He says basically that that's one of the explanations for the decline of war over time. But are there any problems with that explanation?
I think so. And again, I'll bracket this with a caveat that whole books have been written about what I don't know about the Enlightenment, but I know a little. I mean, I've done some. I'm a good University of Chicago undergraduate. You can't escape that place without knowing something about European intellectual history. And from my perspective, the Enlightenment was really a mixed bag in terms of conflict. A lot of the theorists, most primary theorists of socialism, nationalism, all of a lot of the ideologies that Pinker points to as being kind of the evils that that our better angels are forced to deal with. Those philosophers were very much Enlightenment philosophers, and so my sense, when I read through his discussion of the Enlightenment, is that it's extremely one-sided. That he sort of cherry-picked the folks who who argued for ideologies that are now associated with peace, or ideas that are now associated with peace, and has kind of a blind spot when it comes to the ones whose ideas have prompted more conflict. And in fact, I did see some reviews come out for Enlightenment Now when it came out, written by Enlightenment scholars, and I think this was the main point on which it got panned. Was that it was a very selective view of what the Enlightenment was about.
Right. Yeah, and I think that he even tries to exclude some movements from the Enlightenment, like, for example, Romanticism and irrationalism in the 19th century. He basically tries to say that they are not really the product of the Enlightenment.
Right, which is sort of, cherry picking, I think, it's like, you find the ones that you like are the ones that work for your thesis. And conveniently ignore the rest. And I just don't see it. It just doesn't strike me that division really exists. Like I think the Enlightenment was an amazing time, and really incredible flourishing of ideas that still resonate in many ways today. But I don't think it was. It's very difficult for me to try to wrap my head around. Was it on the whole, a good thing or a bad thing when it comes to conflict? I will say that there is one study of the severity of war that goes back before 1812 and uses the correct methodology to assess the severity of war, and it finds that wars actually got more deadly after the Napoleonic period. And so it's entirely possible that a lot of that Enlightenment rationality that ended up producing, railroads and more advanced weaponry and so on and so forth, was indirectly responsible for, even for an increase in the fatality of conflict.
Mhm. And are liberal societies really the most peaceful?
Yes and no. I mentioned earlier that there's evidence that democratic countries don't fight each other, and that evidence is pretty strong. My hesitation is that it tends to be somewhat limited. There's a terrific paper by a colleague of mine who's now at Iowa, Sarah McLaughlin Mitchell, and a couple of her colleagues, that it's a little difficult to parse because it's a pretty technical piece and uses Kalman filters and all sorts of fun statistical techniques. But the end result is that the evidence for peace among democracies ends up being much stronger during the Cold War than it is prior to the Cold War. So I have some hesitation with a blanket endorsement that all democracies across all time are more peaceful, but I think that the record shows certainly that they were for an extended period of time quite recently.
Mhm. And are fewer countries fighting wars nowadays than before?
Yeah, there has been a drop. The only bright point, I didn't really talk about this when we talked about rates of conflict initiation, but I think one of the more depressing things to come out of what I have to say to me was a deeply depressing book to write, is that for the most part, the rate of conflict initiation has increased over the past 200 years. The only bright spot is that it dropped very significantly after the end of the Cold War by something like 60%. So there has been a big change in the rate of conflict initiation recently, but the timing lines up so perfectly with the end of the Cold War that I have a hard time concluding that it has anything to do with, an abrupt, doubling of the enlightenment of the human race or something along those lines.
Mhm. And have the types of war changed over time? I mean, the prevalences of different types of war?
Yeah. There have definitely been surges in different kinds of wars. Civil wars became especially in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a huge surge in civil wars. There was another surge following the end of the Cold War, actually. The rate of initiation of civil wars went up after the end of the Cold War. I don't talk about this. I may mention it briefly in the book, but civil wars are not, for reasons I mentioned earlier, I don't really go into civil wars very much. So yeah, there are some interesting studies, and I'm blanking on the name of the one that I liked the most about the surge in civil wars at the end of the Cold War. But if you just a second. I'll
Sure.
keep talking, you know. Here it is. Right, Stathis Kalivas and Laia Balcells wrote an article in the American Political Science Review called International System and Technologies of Rebellion, How the End of the Cold War Shaped Internal Conflict. Really nice piece talking about how it is that, you know, the end of the Cold War brought about a surge in civil conflict. So yeah, you do see different kinds of conflict sort of, you know, waxing and waning at times. What's really striking is when you aggregate up to the level of the international system, you do see changes in the rate of conflict initiation and warfare across periods. But what you see within periods is a remarkable degree of stability. You know, the 19th century, the rate of conflict initiation hardly budges. You know, there are dips and spikes, but they're not big enough to warrant the conclusion that there's been a fundamental change in the rate of conflict initiation. So one of the things that jumped out at me that was really kind of interesting from this work is how stable rates of conflict initiation tend to be for very long, you know, for decades at a time.
So, I mean, are there at least some types of war that have been in decline?
Sure. There's a kind of war called extra-state war. And the pattern of extra-state wars is actually kind of interesting. Extra-state wars are wars between, you know, a country, a state in the interstate system, and a non-state entity. Now, for a long time, that meant a colony, right? When you said a non-state entity, we're talking about colonial wars. And wars of colonialism are pretty much gone. So those wars really kind of died out. Interestingly, though, extra-state wars have had something of a comeback because groups like ISIS are also non-state entities, right? So what you're seeing in recent years is an abrupt uptick in the number of extra-state wars that states are fighting. And, you know, for a while, we thought extra-state wars were just gone, but now all of a sudden they're a thing again.
What about things like what some people call wars by proxy?
Proxy wars, that, you know, it's funny. I've tried to look into this. There isn't a great definition. There isn't a terrific measure of what a proxy war really is, because it's very, very difficult to evaluate the degree of influence that you know, a major power had over a minor power. If you know, if a country in South America, you know, if there's a rebel group that picks up arms during the Cold War and decides to you know, try to induce a, you know, communist revolution, you know, is that a proxy war fought on behalf of the Soviet Union? Are they fighting independently in expectation that the Soviet Union will probably back them? You know, you get into shades of gray very quickly that are very difficult to adjudicate, right? And often, you know, support is indirect or at the declaratory level, you know, as much as concrete military support. But I do think, I mean, I was at a conference a few years ago with a historian, Neil Ferguson, and one of the things we talked about was proxy wars. And I asked him, you know, in his opinion, what, you know, how do you know a proxy war when you see it? And he said, you know, to his mind, all the wars that were fought during the Cold War were proxy wars, because even if the origins of the war had nothing to do with the disagreement between the superpowers, one side or the other found it advantageous to cloak its cause in the ideological struggle. You know, one side of the ideological struggle between the great powers, like the old line in the U.S. about the Sandinistas in Nicaragua being the moral equivalents of our founding fathers. It's a, you know, a quote from Ronald Reagan. You know, if the Sandinistas were the moral equivalents of our founding fathers, that is a scathing indictment of our founding fathers, at least when it comes to attitudes about democracy. So, you know, in Neil's opinion, all the wars that were fought during during the Cold War proxy wars, but you ask different historians, you'll probably get different answers to that question. But yeah, you see them far less now because there isn't, you don't have the same context within which states fight, right?
Isn't there a particular kind of war that only appeared recently in history that some people call humanitarian war?
Humanitarian interventions, I mean, have probably happened in other places and other times. I don't want to pretend they haven't. But in kind of the modern literature, the first example is the Greek Civil War in the 1820s. And what's his name? There's a terrific book about this as well. And of course, I closed my Zotero a little too quickly. But
you don't have to worry. I will edit these small parts.
You can add it to the notes. Yeah. So Freedom's Battle, Gary Bass, but in 2008, Freedom's Battle: The Origins of Humanitarian Intervention. And he takes a look at the Greek Civil War and argues that was kind of the first modern example of sort of a humanitarian intervention. And we have seen a fair bit of that over time. It's sometimes, again, it's difficult to disentangle the rhetoric of, and international relations scholars have argued and will continue to argue for a long time about whether this intervention or that intervention was really focused on, the result of states behaving in their national interest or, or in kind of altruistic humanitarian for altruistic humanitarian reasons. I think another signpost is the United Nations responsibility to protect doctrine, which sort of created a category of behavior that the international community felt itself responsible for policing. Now, I think the R2P doctrine, as it's called, was articulated at sort of a high level mark for that sentiment in the international system. I don't think it's as active a doctrine as people anticipated it would be. And for one thing, it is very fiercely opposed by China, which does not want to admit the possibility that the international system has the responsibility to protect Tibetans or Uyghurs or any of the other populations within China. So I think it's difficult for that doctrine to become universalized in the face of very staunch opposition from the Chinese, but also I think the incredible duration of some of the wars that the United States has fought in recent years, and the evident problems with state building in the wake of those wars has kind of dampened people's enthusiasm for the responsibility to protect as a doctrine.
So I would like to ask you about another thing that Pinker talks about in his books and that he attributes to Immanuel Kant. So he says that international orders reduce conflict, but is that right?
I don't think he says. I think he quotes Kant on a handful of things.
Yeah.
I don't, his take on international order, I think it's kind of a blind spot in the manuscript, unfortunately, because I think, frankly, that's the strongest argument you can make for how it is that conflict has changed over time. But he sort of equates international order to world government and kind of poo-poos it. He also quotes Norbert Elias quite a bit, the sociologist, and the civilizing process that you mentioned earlier. And I think a very natural extension of Elias's argument is that, Elias basically argues that, what happens over time is that smaller aggregates of human beings fight each other and then kind of merge and cooperate and point their guns outward at other aggregates of the same size. So he sees kind of a ratchet effect in the size of human aggregates. And if you follow that logic, you get up to the point where the international system is, starting to form international orders or aggregates of states. So it's a very natural argument for Pinker's book to take, but I think he doesn't really see it because it's very much a political science argument in the sense that it's a function of politics and the processes that that revolve around politics. He's a cognitive psychologist. He's focused on human beings, better angels, and so our focus tends more to be on what drives state behavior and why it is that when individuals can't get along with one another, they will sort of contract with a leviathan to keep the peace, right, and create some sort of order when order doesn't just spontaneously emerge. That's a process that's really fundamental to political science. It's very natural for us to see. But if your focus is on, the first image, what goes on inside the mind, it's not your sort of natural focus. So it's unfortunate, but to the extent that I think he's onto something, I think it is the answer is that international orders have, in some places at some time, really helped to reduce the rate of conflict initiation.
Mm-hmm. So just to summarize things a little bit, what does the decline of war thesis get right?
What does it get right? I think actually it's, this is probably a common reaction. I believe it most in areas where I know the least. But I think there is this literature on the general science literature on pro-sociality. And one of the striking things about people is that we are, by the standards of other animals, unbelievably cooperative with non-kin groups, right? E.O. Wilson writes a lot about ants, obviously, and how they're able to work together and produce things that, individual insects never would be able to. But, ants have never been to the moon. What humans have been able to do working together is absolutely incredible, just mind-boggling when you step back to think about it. So I think, if the general point is that, humans are incredibly, incredibly cooperative with one another, I think it's a very good point. And I think it's a point that's underappreciated. But we're also, as Harari pointed out in his book, unbelievably violent. Really, really lethal. Wherever we show up, we show up in Australia and the giant wombat disappears, right? Because it's tasty. And so we have, and the Neanderthals are gone, and on and on and on. So, I think it's difficult to understand people without understanding both of those things. And the area where I think the book is strongest is when he focuses on the cooperative aspects of humanity and how it is that, we've come to become so incredibly cooperative. I think the weak points are where he, fails to own up to the flip side of the coin, where, we're also unbelievably violent.
So, are wars irrational? Can we say that they are irrational, or is there some sort of rationality behind them?
It's difficult to categorize wars as a whole. Some of them, I don't know, I'm thinking of the Crimean War as an example of just a dumb war that people, countries slipped into without really having any plan and without any concrete objectives. Well, not without concrete objectives, but it was very much a war that could have been avoided. Whereas, other wars, I think, tend to be much more calculating and much more rational in a sense. But the story that I laid out earlier, the story from Jim Fearon's 1995 piece about how it is that states, take a slight risk of war in order to, get a better negotiating outcome, strikes me as being not an uncommon one. And you can argue that it's irrational to risk war for those objectives, but that argument is generally made in retrospect and only when you actually screw up and end up in a war. I had an interesting discussion with my class when the U.S. killed General Soleimani in Iran, and some people in my class sort of said, "All right, you've written this book about war. Was this a good idea?" And I said, "No, absolutely not. It may, in all likelihood, it will turn out to be nothing. Right? There will be a retaliation of some sort, but it won't escalate." Because the overwhelming majority of potential wars do not escalate. But if it escalates, it will be potentially much, much worse than any of us anticipate. And that is, the stakes should be pretty high if you're going to roll those dice. And Soleimani was, I understand why he was a legitimate target. I understand why I want to say legitimate target. I understand why he was a valued target for the U.S., and I understand why he was targeted, but I don't think they really took into account the risk involved, and I think most people don't until an actual war comes along. So I think there is a rational story about gambling a little bit, running a little risk of war in order to achieve your objectives, and I think we do it all the time. I think we just don't see it because most of the time it doesn't escalate into war.
Mm-hmm. And do we know how to prevent war from happening in the first place?
On the one, there's a great album. Well, the album's okay. The slogan was really great. John Lennon and Yoko Ono. Mm-hmm. War is over if you want it, and they bought billboard space, and went on a press campaign. This whole thing about war is over, and this was during the Vietnam War in the U.S. And reporters asked him, like, how can the war be over? What has to happen? And he said, just put your guns down and stop fighting. And he's right. Like, wars will be over if we don't fight them. But we didn't do that in Vietnam, right? Because there were other things that we wanted more. And my sense is that there always will be. So, yeah, there's absolutely a way to stop wars. We just don't fight them. But I don't think we're going to do it because there are things that we want more than nonviolence.
Mm-hmm. So even if it's wrong, or at least mostly wrong, could telling people that war is in decline have any positive effects?
I don't know, make them feel better about the world for a little while, I guess. I'm mostly worried about the negative effects. I'm mostly worried that we'll become very cavalier and take risks in foreign policy that we don't think we're actually taking because we feel confident that war isn't going to happen. That's in some ways, I think the decline of war thesis is kind of a self-negating argument. I think it's very possible part of the reason that decision makers in 1914 were so cavalier about the decision to go to war is that they had just faced an entire century with virtually no conflict among the major powers. So they had gotten into the habit of running risks and not getting into really big wars. So I think when Germany signed the blank check, when Austria issued its list of demands that they knew were not going to be acceptable, I think, everybody thought this is going to be a small localized war of a kind that we've seen before. It's not going to blow up. It's not going to be any big deal. In part because they all believed, and this was around the time that Norman Angell wrote, The Great Illusion, arguing that, war had now, that countries were now so engaged with each other economically that war was not profitable and shouldn't happen. And so I think and he was not alone, by the way. There were a handful of other books at about the same time saying, look, we've very sort of, prominent precursors to Pinker's argument, but many of them along the same lines. And I think that degree of complacency very much fed into the attitudes of the decision makers at the time of World War I. So I'm, maybe widespread belief in the decline of war thesis will make people happier for a little while, but I'm afraid that the much bigger risk is that it will lead them to be complacent and actually increase the risk of war subsequently.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that the decline of war thesis is politically dangerous?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't, there are dangers to being either, too paranoid about war or too complacent about war. What you really need is, a functioning intelligence service that is, devoid, and national security bureaucracy more generally, that's devoid of those kinds of illusions. That's one of the reasons that when I went on, after I wrote this book and I started going and giving talks, one of the talks was at West Point, for example. I've presented the results to a handful of decision makers in DC, in part because I think it's very important to kind of counter the sense that, and it's a very popular book written by a very prominent scholar, and so I think a lot of it's gained a lot of traction in the intervening years, and it particularly worries me that that people in positions of power in the United States and in other countries will take it seriously and act on it and miscalculate as a result.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the book again is Only the Dead, The Persistence of War in the Modern Age. Would you like to tell people just before we go where they can find you on the internet?
So I'm at Ohio State University, osu.edu. I've got a page there that links to my personal website at braumoeller.info, BRAUMOELLER.info. And that's me. It lays out all, a bunch of different projects that I've carried out, as well as details about the book, which, I thank you so much for taking the time to talk about it. I really appreciate your interest.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show. Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting it on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the interview. The show is brought to you by people like you, so consider doing it. Otherwise, and if you like the interview, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Parerga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Pauline Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingart, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Yugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omer Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslo Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Ethan Solon, Roman Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Belby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz. My producers is Arweba, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafinia, Kian Gilligan, Sergio Godriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Nirvan Balachandran. And my executive producers, Michelle Rzeski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.